Hello, hello, hello. I am back with the podcast. Scott Sambucci here. Listen, if you've been a subscriber listening to the podcast for a while, I've been doing the Startup Selling Show now for, I think, 8 years, since 2015, if I'm not mistaken. The last 7 months, we took some time off, and there's a really good reason for that I'm going to explain to you. And then secondly, what I want to do today is talk to you about a new series that starts off coming up with this podcast, really. And that series is what I call the Go Farther series of episodes that are going to bring us over the next few months together. So first of all, why the break? Why did we take a break from doing the Startup Selling Show? Why do we take a break from the podcast in general? Well, I think the biggest thing is, like you and like for a lot of us in 2023, it was a hard year. It was a hard year for a lot of folks in the world that I live in, the world that you live in. If you're a startup, if you're in the technology world, or just in business in general or life in general, as much as the years through COVID were hard and the years coming out of COVID might have gotten a little bit easier as things started to free up. Lots of stuff happening across the world with wars, with economies, with interest rates, with, especially in the startup world, with a lot of the funding drying up, that waterfall of funding from venture capital down to startups. That affects our business here too, here at Sales Qualia. And so 2023 was a tough year for a lot of folks. And as part of that, for us, what I decided to do in the middle of the year is like really get down to focus on the essential things we needed to do for the business. And so when I looked at all of the activities we're doing when it comes to marketing or content or helping clients or bringing in new clients and all of those things, the podcast was just something that I felt like became expendable. It was hard to do because I've enjoyed and loved doing the podcast over the years, but it was also something that just freed up a few hours every single week for me to do more with clients, for me to do more to help grow our business and help maintain our business. So for all of those reasons, we just decided to take a break. Secondly, though, it also kind of gave me a chance to reset and think about what I wanted to do with the podcast for the last, many years. Most of the episodes have been around interviews with folks in the startup world, folks in the technology world, people that would, help me bring ideas to you that you could put to work for your business. And that interview format is again, it was great for me personally and selfishly, because every time I interviewed somebody who was an expert in their domain or their area of their business, it's a chance for me to get basically an hour's worth of free consulting, a great way for me to learn something new. And then I could share that learning with you as part of the podcast. And, as much as, again, I enjoyed that format, it was something that I was looking to take a break from. So all of that together brings me to what we're going to be doing going forward. Because 2023 was a tough year for us in our business, I mean, we had to grind like crazy just to stay flat from a revenue standpoint. Again, because we serve startups, and startups typically are reliant on venture capital funding or institutional funding or whatever, right? There's that waterfall effect I mentioned a moment ago, where VC money goes into startups, and then startups take some of that money and invest it into our coaching services, our consulting services, all the things that we do here to help them grow and scale. And so if you look at on a macro scale, right, if some of that funding is drying up and startups are required to extend runway or do more with less, despite looking at what we do at Sales Qualia and saying like, wow, it'd be really great to work with you and help me grow and scale our business, it just became really hard for some of them to make investments. So much so that we've had clients, and I've had folks we've talked with at different startups who said like, look, my board of directors has literally told me I am not allowed to spend money on anything that is non-essential. And even though growing is essential, they would view a couple $1,000s a month to work with us as an expendable expense, something to cross off, or something that wasn't worth investing in right now. And instead that I needed to, as a founder, do more with what I had. And that's understandable, right? I mean, we had to do the same thing with our business. And then also last year for me personally, there were some things that went really well, but there was also some things that were kind of a nuisance or a struggle. So I've been training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now for about 2.5 years, but in late 2022, I sustained a shoulder injury, and it just kind of kept lingering all year long, to the point where it was just like at some moments my shoulder would just be throbbing. I would go to class and not be able to fully engage. And it was a really frustrating experience for me not to be able to do my maximum effort. Eventually, I got an MRI on my shoulder, and turns out I have a combination of a torn torn rotator cuff plus some issues with my biceps tendon, along with some arthritis. And it's like, oh, well, no wonder my shoulder was hurting. And then as I come around to my into my middle years, there's some just general age related stuff where you realize like certain things aren't working the way that you want them to. I've got arthritis in my knee. I've got other things that are just take longer to recover from. Sometimes my sleep cycle isn't as good as I want it to be for different reasons. And that some of that stuff is just comes with getting older, if you will. And all of that stuff, I looked at that and I go, okay, well, you know, was 2023 all that bad for me personally? And, what are some things that went well? Well, some things that went really well is that revenue was flat. I mean, in a year where lots of companies were pulling back and, suffering from a reduction in revenue, we ended up being flat for the year. And I was like, okay, that's, not where we want it to be. I had high hopes going into the year to increase revenue pretty significantly. But at the end of the year, okay, revenue is flat. That's not a bad thing. What that did, it forced us as a business to focus. It forced us to pare back, which is one of the reasons the podcast became expendable time. And then through that focus, we ended up bringing in a couple of consulting clients that I was really, and still am very excited to work with, predominantly because they're in the fintech and insurtech space, which is an area where I've got tons of expertise and personal experience selling to banks and insurance companies over the years. So that stuff went well on the business side. And then personally, there's a couple things that did go well. So despite the shoulder industry, I was awarded a blue belt, which is your first colored belt. So there's white belt, blue belt, purple, brown, and then black. So getting past that white belt stage, can take a couple of years. For me, it took me nearly 2 years, but I did earn that belt and I was awarded that belt in May. I was like, okay, that's a big step in my jiu-jitsu journey. In October, I ran my first ultra marathon in a couple of years. I did 100K, which is 62 some miles here in the Bay Area. And, that was a big accomplishment. With my son, I coach a soccer team. In the spring season, we won our bracket, which is hugely exciting for him at what we call the bronze level. And then in fall, we moved up to silver. And again, we won our bracket. So there's some big accomplishments for him and big accomplishments for me as a coach. And then for my wife at work, one of the things we've been looking at is like, how can we help support her more and more with her work as she's becoming more and more influential in the work she does, the research that she's doing over at UC Davis. And she had some pretty big breakthroughs for herself in last year. So there's a lot of things that were going pretty well. And as I look at the change in the calendar from 2023 to 2024 and looking ahead into this year, this is where this concept of go farther and doing a go farther series of podcasts over these next few months kind of came into play. So we talk more about that and what we're going to be doing in this episode or in this series of episodes. So let me just start with the 100K decision, the decision to run the 100K ultra marathon. So I had done my last ultra marathon was in 2021 and it was the Western States 100. I've done a series of podcasts about those and talked about that experience and how it was really, potentially a once in a lifetime opportunity because it's such a difficult race to get into with 6, 7, 8,000 people every year trying to get into 300 or so spots. So I was able to get into that race. I did that race. I had a really good experience at that race in 2021. But coming out of that race, because I put so much effort into training, it was really like a part-time job on top of everything else I was doing. I just felt burned out from the racing and from the running. So that's when I started training jiu-jitsu in 2021 and just really kind of taking a break from running. What I found though, in the middle parts of last year, is I just missed the trail. There's something about, getting up early before the sun is up, strapping on a headlamp, running through the trees, hearing the birds start to chirp when the sun is coming up. You see it, finding a deer out in the middle of a field and seeing, a deer or a couple of deer kind of like take off across a meadow, seeing hawks sometimes running across other kinds of wildlife. I mean, it's just an experience, not to mention the nature and just running through the trees on the trail, ups and downs. It's an experience that for me is just very meditative and helps me clear my mind and get away from the screen and get away from the chaos that can be day to day. And it was also an opportunity for me to feel like I could get like truly fit again. Like training jiu-jitsu is great and there's lots of high intensity stuff there. I certainly continue to exercise and lift weights and those kinds of things. But the running, especially the extended miles that you're doing when you're training, you're doing 40, 50, or 60 miles a week. Sometimes those runs are 15, 20 miles on a day. That's just like a whole new level of exercise and fitness. And I just felt like it was time for me to try to chisel down a little bit more and just both physically and mentally get more fit. But there were some things that I didn't do in that race when I look back in 2023, and I'm okay with it. And there's some conscious choices that I made. Some of those things were that when I decided to train for this race, I promised that it wasn't going to take over my life. I wasn't going to stress about this race. And what I mean by that is in past years, especially for peak races like Western States, like every day I would log every bit of food, every calorie I took in. I would look at my macro nutrients. I would look at my micro nutrients. And of course, from a health standpoint, it's awesome to do those things, but it's also stressful. You got to just constantly be thinking about what am I going to eat and when am I going to eat it and measuring out your food. It just takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. There was a lot of things that I sacrificed when I was training for Western States. There's some time away from the family for these longer trail runs over the weekend, or there were some times where I couldn't take my son to school because I would get up early and hit the trail or do something else. And so I told myself that if I was going to train for this 100K, I wasn't going to let it take over my life. And so, that meant, I'd still have beers over the weekend. If it's like Saturday night, we wanted to go to the brewery, I'd have a beer or two. If it, was, dessert, was there, I would go to Trader Joe's. One of my favorite desserts is ginger snaps from Trader Joe's. It's just like a really tasty treat for me. I didn't follow like a strict paleo diet. So I was, still eating bread and carbs and pastas and those kinds of things. So I got fit, but I didn't get down to the level that I wanted to. And the race went well, but it didn't go as well as it could have. And again, I was fine with that. I just wanted to get on the trail. I just wanted to get healthy. I wanted to have a reason to build that base level of fitness for myself. But then, turned into the race was in October. And like I said, the race went pretty well. I finished in a little over 16 hours, which now looking back, I mean, I know that race I could have done if I was at peak fitness, it probably could have come much closer to 14 hours. So, 2 hours is a pretty significant amount of time that I could have trained for that I chose not to. So that race was in October. And now you're mid-October, late October, and then we start rolling into the holidays, right? So, Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays. Obviously, going in from Thanksgiving to Christmas, lots of food, lots of festivities. And then that whole period around Christmas of a couple of weeks where you're going to holiday parties and you're having friends over, or you're going over to friend's house. And then there's New Year's Eve and there's everything that goes with it. I was, drinking more often than I normally would. I think over a 2-week period, I went out and had alcohol like 4 or 5, 6 times, and it wasn't a lot. It was like a couple glasses of wine or a couple of beers, stuff like that, because you're just out and you're having fun, and that's okay, right? But on the other hand, I was just like, man, like I was waking up a little groggy. I was wake up not really with a hangover, but missing, the mental acuity and the sharpness I would usually have without drinking alcohol or without drinking or without eating some of the sweets and all of those things. And so over the holidays, we had some family over, and I told myself, like, look, one of the things I'm going to do, even if I'm going to be doing the holiday thing, I'm still going to exercise every day. So starting around December 20th, I just said, look, every day I'm going to exercise. And it's just a way for me to kind of help balance out some of the alcohol, some of the sweets, and some of the overzealous eating, if you will. And it definitely helped. But basically, what I realized is it was time to get strict. It was time to get disciplined for myself. There's this concept that I learned from a book called The Big Leap, a book by a guy named Gay Hendricks. And in The Big Leap, the concept that he talks about is this concept of upper limits and lower limits. And so the concept is that most of us live our life in a sine wave. So if you can imagine, that sine wave, imagine a frequency of sound or waves. And the upper limit is the place where most of us will say, look, we have a concept of what we could do with ourselves, based on our skills, based on our ability, based on our knowledge. And so for me, an upper limit might say, look, if I'm going to run this 100K race, my upper limit might be to do this race in 14 and a half hours, right? And if I train like hell and I do everything I can, I know my physical limitations, but I also know my physical skills. Like if I do all of that work, I could get to 14 and a half hours. And that's like the best I think I could do. And that would be considered an upper limit. It's the best I think I can do. Now, on the other hand, there's what are called lower limits. And these are places where for all of us, and I know for me, this is kind of where I was feeling over the Christmas period, is this is the period where you're like, I'm really not doing the things that I could or should be doing. And there's a point where we all kind of have this lower limit psychologically where we say, enough is enough. I've had enough. My weight's a little high, or my mental acuity is a little off, or I'm just not producing well at work. I'm not producing well physically. I'm not doing great with my relationships. Whatever the thing is that we're measuring, there's a lower limit where all of us at some point, you hit that bottom and you say, you know what, enough is enough. I know I can do more. I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm going to start working my way up towards, an improvement. And you sort of work on that upslope. So that's where that sine wave comes in, where you're going in these ups and downs and ups and downs. And for me, I kind of hit that lower limit. I kind of said, enough is enough. I'm not going to do this anymore. So starting January 1st, I made a commitment to myself. And the commitment was that in January, there's 31 days in January, I was going to do 50 workouts plus jujitsu classes throughout the month. So, for example, there's a morning jujitsu class at 6 a.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If I go to that class from 6 to 7, that counts as one of the 50. Later on that day, I might go out to my garage and lift some weights. That's number 2. Right. On Wednesday, I might decide to go for a 5-mile run. That's a third workout. Thursday, go to jiu-jitsu class. And then in the afternoon, I'm going to go to the pool and swim. So that's, number 4 and number 5. So to get to 50, is required discipline around, okay, how am I going to fit all of this stuff in? How am I going to make sure I maintain my commitment to doing these jiu-jitsu classes, getting up early enough that I can get some work done before I go to class, get back in order to get breakfast and then get my son to school. So it was just like this mindset of discipline, right? To get this done. And, through that, it kind of gave me that focus. It gave me, the ability to kind of reset myself. The other thing I committed to was just my diet, right? I said, look, no desserts, no alcohol, I'm going to cut back on carbs. I wasn't going to go super crazy and try to go pure ketogenic or paleo diet, but I was definitely going to cut back on carbs. So no purposeful carbs, no breads, no pasta, certainly no sugars or added sugars. And it was just like sticking to this. And I found that, the first week was actually pretty easy because you're just like motivated. But then the second week is where things got hard. Like the weather was bad outside. It's like you're getting into January. The post-holiday stuff is wearing off. The Christmas tree comes down, the lights come down, the days are really short. A lot of stuff, it's just hard to get yourself moving. And I kind of pushed through that second week. And then I had some travel. I went overseas to London to visit with a client for a few days. That became hard because I'm like, okay, I got to get the hotel workouts in. I got to make sure I stay disciplined on my diet and all of those things. And I managed to power through and hit the 50 number in 31 days. So I was really proud about that. And so much so that I kept it going into February. And so in February, I've exercised every day. So every day in 2024, I've done some form of exercise. Some of that is big workouts like swimming or a big weightlifting session. And sometimes it's like a quick 25-minute workout in the garage where I'm doing some stretching and some light weights and some quick high intensity. So again, I'm like sharing all this as background, because this is where that transition for me is something I want to share with you in this Go Farther series of podcasts. And that brings us to, what is Go Farther? If you haven't heard this concept, had me talk about this concept before. And what does it mean? And how do I think it might be able to help you and help me talk about this? And so Go Farther is a concept that I first thought of back in 2016. So in 2016, I competed in this race called Uberman. So Uberman is a multi-day triathlon. So you can think of it as like an ultra triathlon. So an ultra marathon is anything over 26.2 miles. So 50K, 50 miles, 100K, 100 miles, those are all ultra marathons. Well, before I did ultra marathons, I used to do triathlons. I've done three Ironman triathlons in 2011, 2010, 11, and 13. And so I was back then still kind of doing triathlon stuff. And I had this idea for myself that I was going to do my own personal ultra triathlon. And I was going to do a swim that included a swim in Lake Tahoe, across Lake Tahoe. Then I was going to do a 300-mile bike ride on my own up in the mountains in the Tahoe region. And then I was going to do a 100-mile run. And this is just something I was going to do on my own. I'd called it the California Man, and I had it mapped out. I planned it out. I had spreadsheets. I'd pick some dates. I started thinking about when I was going to do this. I talked to my wife. She was going to run crew with my son and be support. It was just going to be something I could do just to see how far I could push myself. Well, at the same time, unbeknownst to me, there's a guy down in Los Angeles that was putting together this race called Uberman. And a friend of mine named Kim texted me about it. She said, "Have you heard about this thing called Uberman?" And so Uberman was a long distance swim. So it was a swim across the Catalina Channel, which is a 21-mile swim. And then it was a bike ride. It was 400 miles from Los Angeles into Death Valley. And then the run portion was an ultra marathon, which mirrored the Badwater Ultra Marathon. Of course, it's 135 miles from Death Valley at Badwater, which is the lowest point in the continental US, up to the portal of Mount Whitney, which is about a 9,000 foot peak. The portal's at 9,000 feet. Mount Whitney peaks at 14,000. And so I was like, well, if this guy is organizing this race, I'll just do his race. I don't have to do it on my own. This is obviously a crazy endeavor. And I wasn't, at a point physically where I was like mentally or physically ready to do this kind of race, but I just committed to doing this in April. So I committed in April of 2016, and the race was in October. Now, here's what was really interesting about this. And this is where this concept of go farther started to emerge for me. So April 2016 was also a pivotal moment in my business. Back in fall of 2015 is when I officially started Sales Qualia as my full-time job. So I had been doing some side consulting and coaching and some workshops for a couple of years through different startup groups. I was invited to do a workshop at the Lean Startup Conference. I was doing some workshops with different meetup groups. I would always pick up some one-on-one coaching clients along the side and just kind of helping out startups as I was head of sales at Blend Labs, and before that as an executive at CoreLogic. And it was a nice little side business. It was a side gig. It kept me sharp. It brought in a little extra income, but most of my focus was still working at CoreLogic and then at Blend Labs. But in 2015, early in that year, as Blend Labs was growing really quickly, back then my son was really small and my wife was still in graduate school. And as the company was ramping up and scaling up, and we were picking up new clients like Wells Fargo and NationStar and Freedom Mortgage, like it was like this rocket ship of a startup was really, really taking off. This is in 2013, 14, 15. Eventually, the company went public in 2021. So just to give you some context there, right? I mean, this is 2015, and this is when, the ship is really, really starting to fire. But I was really struggling with the balance between doing the work required at Blend Labs, all of the travel, all the implementations, being on the road. I was commuting 2.5 hours each way from Davis, California, where I live, over to San Francisco on the train. So I was doing that commute 3 or 4 days a week. I'd get up and take a train at 4:45 a.m. to be at the office by 7:30. And then I would stay in the office, work until 4 or 5 p.m. and then take the train home and get home at 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. I was doing that 3-4 days a week. Meanwhile, my son was very young. My wife was in grad school. It was just, those are the weeks I was home. Those didn't count the weeks where I would have to travel. I'd have to go to Dallas or Chicago or DC or New York or whatever for different meetings. So it just became untenable. And I just decided, like, look, I've got to take a step away from this world. I've got to be home more. I want my wife to finish her PhD. I want to be able to be a better dad now that my son is getting older. So I made that conscious decision to leave Blend Labs in 2015. So I transitioned out of Blend Labs, and that's when I started Sales Qualia as my full-time job, if you will. And so by April of 2016, I had been at this for 6 months, and things were going okay at first, right? I had a handful of clients from my side gig that I could bring in. I started building out the coaching program that is today and started adding new clients, but it really wasn't taking off the way I wanted it to take off. I had to pick up a couple of teaching gigs at a university as an adjunct professor to help fill income gaps and help make sure we had enough to pay the mortgage and do all those things. I didn't have health insurance. We had health insurance, fortunately, through my wife at school. But, it's just like by April, though, it was the real doldrum of the business. Like I literally went the whole month in April without bringing in any new clients. Revenue was pretty sparse. The teaching gigs that I was what I was doing, those were completing. It was a quarter system. So in March, end of March is when all the teaching ended up and the paychecks from the teaching dried up. And I remember being in a shared workspace in San Francisco, and I was preparing for a workshop that I was going to do later that evening. And I was on the phone with my business coach that I was working with at the time, a guy named Adam. And I was just really having a hard time. And I said, look, man, like things are not going well. I can't bring in a new client for whatever reason. Revenue is tight. I'm not bringing any money. I'm feeling some pressure at home. I said, I have a call with a potential client coming up in about an hour before this workshop starts. And I feel like if this person says no, then I'm going to throw up. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he kind of calmed me down. He's like, look, man, you're doing all the right stuff. You're doing the workshops. You're building out your go-to-market. You're building out your marketing. You've got this workshop coming up tonight. You always kill it at workshops. You're going to do a good job there. Like, even if this person tells you no, you're not going to throw up. You're not going to fail. Don't worry about it. So he kind of like calmed me down, and I did talk to that potential client. They did say no, and I brushed it off. I was like, it's fine. And I ran that workshop. And that night, that workshop was the best workshop that I had run. Like I nailed it. Right. And we got some new leads from it who eventually became clients in May. But it was in that month when I was in those doldrums that I heard about this Uberman race. And I told myself, like, look, man, I'm going to do this. Like, I feel like I need to do this. I need to have this distraction. That's who I am. I am a person outside of work that needs this outlet, this mental and physical challenge to relieve stress, to give myself a different thing to focus on outside of work. So I'm just not obsessed with work. And so out of those doldrums and out of that decision by October, those 6 months at work were like, I basically broke through the ceiling. I broke through my upper limit at work. And now we were doing recurring revenue. We were getting money in the door consistently. The business was starting to grow. I was able to hire a couple of people at that point to help me out with the business. So I was like, okay, the business is going well. And also in October, I competed in Uberman. Now at Uberman, I did do the full Catalina Channel swim, which ended up being almost 24 miles for me because of the currents and the wind and everything else that I was competing with. You don't always swim straight as an arrow as much as you want to. The bike portion, I was only able to do about 140 miles of the bike because my shoulders were so wrecked from doing the swim. And then the run portion, I did a good chunk of it, but because I had sliced open my feet when I landed on shore on some rocks and some shells, I just got to a point where I was like, look, I've done enough of this to know what is possible for me. And I had my family around me, and I had a good friend of mine named Tim, who was with me when I just decided to pull the plug. And I was like, look, man, I've done enough. And that's what I realized, like, what was the purpose of all of this? Like, why sign up for this crazy long race that only one other person even tried to do? So the race had two people in it. I was one of them. The guy who actually finished the full race took him 8 days. It took him 8 days to do this race, right? I was the only other knucklehead that tried to do this thing end to end solo. What it helped me realize is that through the training, through the preparation, through everything that went into doing that Uberman race, it's really about breaking through what you think is possible. It's about breaking through those upper limits that Gay Hendricks talks about in his book, The Big Leap. And so breaking through those upper limits is what led me to start doing ultra marathons. And so the ultra marathons, I ended up doing 200-mile races called the Tahoe 200. I did that race in 2017, 2019. I've done 4 100-mile races. I've done a couple of other long distance races, a couple 50-milers, lots of 50Ks. And it just like became part and parcel for who I am and what I do. But it's all because I made that decision to try to break through that upper limit. And, around Uberman, I did some podcasts talking about this concept. And then later in 2021, when I ran the Western States 100, I did a series of podcasts around that as well. And so this concept to go farther was just basically saying, like, how can I do more? How can I be happy? And how can I surprise myself with the results? How can I do more, be happy, and surprise myself? And that's this concept to go farther. And so, a lot of what we're going to talk about in this series of podcasts coming up over these next couple months, some of it is not going to be truly original. It might be things that you've heard of in some form or fashion from other people. It might be concepts that I'm directly taking, and I'll give citations. But what I'm going to do is really try to make this relevant to you and base it on personal experience, because I feel like people like you and I are a lot alike. We're startup entrepreneurs. We're running businesses. We have families. We have responsibilities outside of work. For me, I have aging parents. Many of you might have that same issue as well, where you get those phone calls everywhere. Oh, dad's in the hospital for this, or mom's doing that. She has to go see the physician again. And overall, my parents are still generally pretty healthy, but as they get into their 70s, mid 70s, that those thoughts creep in your mind. It's like, man, am I gonna have to confront, these things? And some of you may have already had to do those. I mean, that's just part of life in general, that circle of life where your parents take care of you and then you end up taking care of them. My son is getting older and I want to be able to spend that time with him. And I still do breakfast in the morning and I still take him to school as much as I can. I pick him up and I coach his soccer teams and I make sure I don't work too much on weekends because I want to be there and be around to do those things. And I want to have a great relationship with my wife. We're coming up to 18 years of marriage now. And, it's just amazing to feel like I've now spent 18 years of my life with a single person and we're raising our son. So we've got all of those things going on. And I think it's a lot of what people like you and others around us are going through every single day. And so with this podcast series, all I want to do is take some of these concepts that I've learned through doing these ultra marathons, doing these crazy races, doing some of the things that I'm doing with my business and things that I'm learning and things that I'm implementing in places where I'm failing, and basically try to translate those in a way that might be something that is helpful for you to take, once a week, something that you can think about, something you can apply, something you can share with your team or share with your partners, and ultimately just help us all go a little bit farther. To go farther, all of us can probably do a little bit more. A lot of us can all be a little bit happier. A lot of us could all surprise ourselves. And that's what I want to do. So my only ask is that, number one, that if you don't already subscribe to the podcast, please go ahead and do that. I think if you give these episodes give a couple episodes a chance, I think there's probably going to be something in there for you. Tell me what you like. Tell me what is helping. Tell me what you would like to see more of. You can hit me up with a quick email. My email address is Scott, SCOTT, at salesqualia, sales, QUALIA.com. Shoot me a note. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. Hit me up on LinkedIn. If you find me, Scott Sambucci, I'm the only Scott Sambucci that I know of on LinkedIn. I just had a DM swap with somebody last week who was on my profile, and I sent him a quick note, said, "Hey, how's it going? Good to hear from you." And he said, "I was just seeing if you had any content coming up about your races or ultra marathons. I was looking for some inspiration." And so I said, "Good news. I got the series coming out." And so, I want to communicate. I want to hear from people that are looking for that little extra boost. And if there's something I can do to help you, then I want to be able to do that for you. So I think it's just important to remember we're all in this together as peers, as parents, as people, as humans. And I want to talk about, mindset and actions and choices and obstacles and opportunities and obstructions and all the things getting in the way or slowing us down or stopping us from getting to where we want to go. And I think we'll know this is working with little shifts and little nudges and little changes in the things we're doing, the choices we make, the decisions that we make, maybe little improvements. And so the faster we start, the faster we grow. And that's why I'm just starting today. So, it's been told to me, and I think it's true, like all of us are on this hero's journey. We all want to be a better person. We all want to be a better parent. We want to be a better partner. We want to be a better entrepreneur. We want to be a better business leader. We want to be a better vendor and partner for our customers. We all want to be a better human. And there's ups and downs, and there's challenges and obstacles. And so anything that I can do to help you, move a little bit forward, I want to do that. So I can't wait to get started. And I hope to hear from you about these episodes. So let's do this, shall we? So just remember, do more, be happy, surprise yourself, go farther. Let's do this. Thanks for listening and look forward to the next episode coming out very soon. This is Scott Tambucci signing off.